Not the dramatic kind of shaking people imagine. My hands were steady. Too steady. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and warm printer plastic, and the only sound in the house was the soft scrape of paper against paper as I lined every corner up square. The first photograph showed my husband kissing my best friend over two newborn bassinets. Two. Not one mistake. Not one late night that could be folded into a lie and prayed over. Twins, swaddled side by side, with my best friend's hand resting on his chest like she had earned the place I spent 11 years building. I had known Odessa since we were 19. She knew where I kept the spare towels. She knew which mug was mine. She had sat across from me at this same table, eating takeout off paper plates, asking if I was okay when my husband started coming home late. That was the part that made the floor feel colder than it should have under my bare feet. Not that Callum betrayed me. That Odessa knew exactly where it would hurt the most, and chose that spot anyway. I didn't call him. I didn't drive to the hospital. I didn't send one message asking how long, how many nights, how much of my life had quietly become a joke I wasn't in on. I signed where the lawyer had marked the pages. Quietly. Cleanly. No crying on the paper. No speech for a man who had already written his answer in a photograph. Then I slid one copy into a plain folder and kept the pictures face down underneath it. I remember standing at the kitchen window for a long while before I ever left the house, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one down Larch Street, thinking about how ordinary the evening looked from the outside. Neighbors walking dogs. A sprinkler ticking against someone's fence. The whole street unaware that inside my kitchen, an entire decade of my life had just been quietly filed away in a manila folder. By sunset, his truck pulled into his parents' driveway like nothing in the world had changed. The porch light was already on. Through the front window, I could see his mother, Pauline, sitting at the dining table, folding napkins she didn't need to fold. He walked in carrying a duffel bag and the confidence of a man who thought the worst thing waiting for him was a lecture about missing Sunday dinner. I stayed parked across the street, engine off, and watched the house where he had run to be somebody's son before he had to answer for being my husband. Pauline opened the door. At first she looked tired. Then she saw the folder in his hand, and her whole face shifted, like she'd been waiting 3 years for a knock she hoped would never come. "She knows everything. You never told?" she asked. Callum froze in the doorway. "Told me what, Mom?" Pauline's hand was still on the frame, knuckles pale. She looked past him, out toward the street, toward my car under the maple tree, like she already knew I was there. "Nothing," she said too fast. "Come inside before the neighbors start staring." But it wasn't nothing. I had spent 11 years learning that woman's face, and I knew a confession trying to swallow itself when I saw one. Rewind 3 years, and you'd have found a version of me who still believed marriage meant safety. I was 29 when I married Callum. My grandmother had left me a modest 2-bedroom house on Larch Street, one of the only things she owned outright after 40 years of teaching elementary school, and I'd spent my 20s fixing it up room by room, sanding the banister myself, learning to patch drywall from online videos at midnight. Callum moved in the week after the wedding, charming and easy, the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee before you finished saying it, who could make an entire room feel like it existed just to listen to him. Odessa was already woven into my life by then. We'd been roommates in college, bridesmaids at each other's cousins' weddings, the kind of friends who didn't need an occasion to show up with wine and bad reality television. When Callum and I got engaged, she cried harder than my own mother did, and told me she'd never felt luckier to watch a friend build the life I was building. I used to think that meant something good. The first 2 years were, if I'm honest, close to what I'd always pictured. Callum worked steadily as a regional accounts manager at a logistics company outside the city, and I taught art at the same elementary school where my grandmother had once taught reading. We hosted small dinners. We repainted the porch together one long weekend in April. Odessa came over most Sundays, and the 3 of us fell into an easy rhythm that felt less like a marriage with a third wheel and more like a small, chosen family. The cracks started small, the way they always do. Callum began picking up extra shifts, an audit here, a client dinner there, until working late stopped sounding like an event and started sounding like a schedule. Odessa, freshly divorced and between jobs, started showing up more, just to keep me company, she said, while he worked late. She'd bring dinner. She'd stay until I fell asleep on the couch watching whatever show we'd left paused. I thought I was lucky to have people who cared enough to fill the empty hours. I didn't know I was watching my own replacement audition in real time. Looking back, there were details I should have caught. The way Odessa started dressing differently, softer colors, the kind Callum always said he liked on me. The way she'd laugh a beat too long at things he said, or finish his sentences the way I used to. The way her phone would light up during our dinners, and she'd turn it face down without reading it, like she already knew who it was from and didn't want me to notice her not looking. There was a night, maybe 14 months into the marriage, when I came home early from a parent-teacher conference that ended sooner than expected, and found them sitting closer on the couch than I would have expected, a full cushion of space suddenly appearing between them the second the door opened. I remember thinking it was strange. I remember deciding, actively, consciously, to let it go, because the alternative meant questioning the two people I trusted most in the world, and I wasn't ready to live in a house where I questioned everything. I caught none of it in time, not because I was foolish, but because I had built my entire adult understanding of loyalty around these two people. Betrayal from a stranger is a wound. Betrayal from your closest friend and your husband, at the same time, isn't a wound. It's a foundation collapsing, and you don't feel the floor go until you're already falling. The photographs came to me by accident, the way the truth usually does. A coworker of Callum's, someone I barely knew, sent them to my personal email with no message attached, just a subject line that read, "You deserve to know." I still don't know her reasons, whether it was guilt, decency, or something between them I never learned about. I've never needed to. Some truths don't require a motive attached to be worth receiving. The hospital date stamp on the corner of the images told me the twins had been born 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks that Callum had spent sleeping in our bed, kissing me goodnight, telling me his late nights were about a supply chain audit. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I sat at the kitchen table until the coffee went cold and burned itself into the bottom of the pot, and I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like clarity. I wasn't going to give him the version of this where I begged for an explanation. I was going to give him the version where I already knew. The lawyer I called wasn't the first one I found online. She was the one my grandmother had used decades earlier for the deed to the house on Larch Street, still practicing at 71, sharp as anything. When I told her what I'd found, she didn't gasp or offer sympathy I didn't ask for. She asked one question. Is the house in both your names, or just yours? It was just mine. My grandmother had been specific about that in the paperwork, and I'd never added Callum to the deed, not out of suspicion, just habit, inertia, the kind of thing you mean to get around to and never do. It turned out to be the single most important oversight of my marriage. Then you're in a stronger position than you think, she said. Bring me everything. Every account, every statement, every message you can find. We move quietly, and we move fast. I spent the next 4 days doing exactly that, moving through the house like an auditor of my own life. Bank statements showed a savings account I didn't know existed, opened 8 months earlier, fed by consulting fees that didn't match anything on his actual pay stubs. Text threads I found on a shared laptop weren't just romantic. They were logistical. Odessa had asked him in writing what would happen to the house once things were finalized, and Callum had told her not to worry, that he'd handle Larkin. Handle. Like I was a line item. Like 11 years could be filed under a task he'd get around to eventually. That was the moment the ache in my chest turned into something colder and far more useful. The deeper I went, the clearer the timeline became. Odessa hadn't just fallen into this by accident during a lonely stretch of her divorce. There were messages dating back nearly 2 years, long before I ever noticed anything wrong, conversations that started as comfort and slowly turned into something else entirely. She had asked him once, in a message time-stamped almost a year and a half earlier, whether he ever thought about what could have been between them, back before either of us existed in each other's lives. He'd told her not yet. Not while things with Larkin were still useful. Useful. That word sat in my chest for days. They hadn't just been having an affair. They'd been running a slow, patient plan, one that assumed I would either never notice, or notice too late to have any leverage left. What they hadn't accounted for was my grandmother's stubborn insistence, decades earlier, on keeping that deed in one name only, and a 71-year-old lawyer who still answered her own phone on Saturdays. Back in the driveway, I finally got out of the car. Gerald, my father-in-law, was the one who saw me first, standing at the edge of the porch with his arms crossed the way he always did when a storm was rolling in over the fields behind the house. He'd worked construction his whole life, built additions on half the houses on this street, including, I would later learn, part of the very foundation Callum thought he could stand on to threaten me. "Larkin," he said, and something in his voice wasn't surprise. It was recognition, like a man watching whether he'd been forecasting for months. Inside, I could hear Pauline's voice rising, and Callum's dropping into that low, controlled tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while backing someone into a corner. I walked up the porch steps and knocked, even though the door was open, because some part of me wanted him to have to invite me into the exact room where his mother had almost told him the truth without me. Pauline's face, when she saw me standing there with the folder held loosely at my side, wasn't guilt. It was relief. "I told him he needed to talk to you before it went any further," she said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. "I told him months ago." Callum's jaw tightened. "Mom, not now." "It's already now, Callum," she said. "It's been now since the day I found out and you asked me to keep it quiet." That was the 6-word confession hiding underneath her earlier question. She hadn't just suspected. She had known for months, and she had chosen her son's comfort over my right to the truth. I felt something in me go very still and very sharp. "How long have you known?" I asked her directly, because I wanted to hear her say it out loud, in front of him, in front of Gerald. Pauline's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "Since March," she admitted. "I found out at the same time you would have, if he'd let anyone tell you." I begged him to end it before there were children involved. He told me it was already too late. March. 9 months before those twins were born. 9 months of dinners at this house, of Pauline hugging me at the door, of her asking about my job and my grandmother's old rose bushes, while sitting on a secret that was going to detonate my entire life. I turned to Callum. "You had 9 months to tell me the truth, and instead you let your own mother carry it for you." He didn't deny it. That was almost worse than if he had. "I was going to tell you," he finally said, "after things settled down. After the babies came. I just needed time to figure out how to do it without losing everything." "You didn't need time," I said. "You needed an audience willing to keep quiet long enough for you to decide when the truth was convenient for you. That's not the same thing as needing time. That's just needing cover." Gerald, who had stayed silent in the doorway until then, finally spoke. "Son, I told your mother this would come apart on its own. Secrets built on other people's backs always do." Callum's jaw worked, but nothing came out. For a man who had spent 9 months rehearsing explanations in his head, he had remarkably few of them ready when it actually mattered. Here's where the story could have ended, with a scene of confrontation, tears, a slammed door, the kind of ending people expect from a betrayal like this. But I hadn't come to that house for an argument. I had come to deliver papers, and I still had one more thing in that folder he didn't know about yet. I set it down on the dining table Pauline had been folding napkins on 20 minutes earlier, and I opened it to the second half, the part that wasn't photographs. It was a printed summary from my lawyer, laying out, in plain language, exactly what the discovery period had turned up. The consulting fees in that hidden account weren't consulting fees at all. They were withdrawals, redirected in small enough amounts to avoid tripping any joint account alerts, funneled out of a business line of credit Callum managed at work under an account he wasn't authorized to independently access at that value. In trying to build a financial cushion for his new family before I found out, he had crossed a line that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with his employer. I hadn't gone looking for that. My lawyer had simply asked the accountant to trace every unfamiliar transaction, and it had surfaced on its own, the way rot in a foundation eventually shows itself in a cracked wall. "I'm not asking you to explain this to me," I told him, my voice level in a way that surprised even me. "My attorney advised me to disclose these transactions because my name appears on our joint tax filings, and I have no intention of being liable for money I never touched. What happens next is between you and your employer." The color drained out of Callum's face faster than it had drained out of his mother's on the porch. "You didn't," he said. "I signed the divorce papers this morning," I said. "Everything after that stopped being my responsibility to protect. There's one more piece of this I haven't told you yet, the part that almost undid my resolve to stay quiet and let the paperwork speak for me." About 3 weeks after that night on the porch, Odessa showed up at the school where I taught, waiting by my car in the parking lot after the final bell. I hadn't spoken to her once since the photographs arrived. I deleted her number the same afternoon I found them, not out of anger exactly, more out of a refusal to keep her stored anywhere in my life, even as a name on a screen. She looked tired in a way I almost felt sorry for, until she opened her mouth. "You didn't have to go after his job," she said, arms crossed over a stomach still soft from delivery. "We have 2 babies now, Larkin. Do you understand what you've done to us?" I remember standing there, keys in hand, genuinely searching myself for the anger I expected to feel, and finding something quieter instead. "I didn't go after anything," I told her. "I protected what was mine, and the truth did the rest. You and Callum built this yourselves, message by message, dollar by dollar, for almost 2 years before I ever found out. I just stopped covering for it." "We were going to tell you eventually," she said, echoing the same tired line Callum had used on the porch, as if the two of them had rehearsed the same excuse from different scripts. "Eventually isn't honesty," I said. "Eventually is just delayed permission you were hoping I'd never ask for." She didn't have an answer for that. She stood there a moment longer, maybe waiting for me to soften, to offer some kind of olive branch built on the years we used to share. When it didn't come, she turned and walked back to her car without another word. I sat in my own car for a long time after that, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, and realized something that surprised me. I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd won some argument in a parking lot, but because I finally understood that the woman standing there wasn't my best friend anymore, and hadn't been for a long time. She was just someone I used to know, wearing a face I used to trust. I won't pretend the months that followed were simple. Divorces rarely are, even the quiet ones. But the pieces I had gathered in those 4 frantic days did exactly what my lawyer promised. Because the house was solely mine, it was never on the table. Because the affair and the concealment were documented, and because a portion of Callum's hidden savings had been sourced from funds he wasn't authorized to move, the settlement wasn't a negotiation. It was closer to a formality. His employer opened an internal investigation within 2 weeks of the disclosure. What disciplinary action followed wasn't my concern, and I never asked to see the details. I did hear, months later, through channels I hadn't gone looking for, that he'd been demoted out of the role that had given him access to those accounts, and that the promotion he'd been chasing for as long as I'd known him, the one he used to talk about over dinner like it was already his, went to someone else that spring. Odessa, who had been counting on that hidden cushion to help raise 2 newborns without going back to work right away, found herself instead raising them on a single, closely watched income, in an apartment considerably smaller than the house she'd once helped me pick paint colors for. I heard, through the kind of small-town channels that never fully close, that the two of them argued constantly that first year, about money, about exhaustion, about the version of the future they'd promised each other that had quietly stopped matching reality. Pauline called me once, about 2 months after that night on the porch. She didn't ask me to forgive her, which I respected more than any apology she could have offered. She asked if I still had my grandmother's rose bushes, because she remembered how much I loved them, and she wanted me to know she thought about that house sometimes, and about the version of her son she had hoped for and never quite got. I should have told you in March, she admitted, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I let loyalty to my son cost you 9 months you can't get back. Keeping his secret was the biggest mistake of my life, and I'll carry that longer than he ever will. I told her the roses were doing fine. I didn't tell her that some things, once broken, don't get repotted. They just get left behind in soil that finally belongs to someone who deserves it. As for Callum, the last thing I heard secondhand, through people who still felt obligated to update me, was that he and Odessa were struggling under the weight of 2 infants, a mortgage he could no longer easily afford on his own, and a partnership built on the same foundation of secrecy he'd once used against me. I don't know if that foundation will hold for them long term. I've stopped checking. Some questions aren't worth the rent they charge in your head. I kept the house on Larch Street. I repainted the porch a color entirely my own choosing this time. I replanted the roses in spring, and they came back fuller than they had in years, as if the ground itself had been waiting for a season without secrets buried in it. And for the first time in longer than I want to admit, the only person deciding what happens in my kitchen, my mornings, and my future, is me. People still ask me sometimes if I regret staying quiet that day instead of screaming everything I felt onto that porch. I don't. Silence, when you use it right, isn't weakness. It's the space you need to gather everything you're owed before anyone has the chance to talk you out of taking it. So here's what I keep coming back to, the question I can't quite put down. If you found out the 2 people closest to you had built an entire secret life behind your back, for years, in rooms you once thought were safe, would you have confronted them the moment you found out? Or would you have done what I did, and let your silence become the loudest thing in the room, while you quietly built the case that would end it for good? What would you have done? Would you have confronted them the moment you found out, or stayed silent until you had proof strong enough to end it for good? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where betrayal meets justice, subscribe to Sophie Revenge for a brand new story every single day.